Dale asked if we were still in chapter 1. And yeah, we're trying to cover one word per week. So last week, though, we did look at the subdivisions that are found in the Bible, both the Old Testament. There's 4 subdivisions, or 5, depending on how you classify them. The Law, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also called the Torah or the Pentateuch. Then history, containing 12 books. Then poetry, containing 5 books. And then prophecy, which is divided up into the major prophets that are 5 and the minor prophets, which are 12. Some people, instead of putting both of those under the category of prophecy, divide them into separate categories by themselves. But
you know when the Torah came in?
Around 1500 BC. Well, the Torah itself is what Moses wrote. Then you have the commentaries about it, which would be the Gemara and that those type of things. It's the commentary. The Talmud. Right.
The Talmud was what now?
The Mishnah and Gemara, or Gemara. That's the commentaries about the Torah. And the statement in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28 and 29, that Jesus spoke as one having authority, was a stark contrast between his teaching and the teaching of the rabbis of that day, because what the rabbis would do is go through what the commentary said. This rabbi said this, this rabbi said this, this rabbi said this. And you don't see any of that in Jesus' teachings. That's why they recognized he set himself up as the standard of authority. We also looked at the Jews' classification. That's the law or the Torah. Then the prophets, they had the former prophets and the latter prophets, and then the rest of them were writings. So the New Testament had 4 subdivisions, or 5, depending on how they're classified. The 4 accounts of the gospel. It's not 4 gospels, but 4 accounts of, well, I'd rather say instead of the gospel, the life of Christ. Then you have 1 book of history, which is Acts. Then the epistles, which can have 21 books, but those are divided depending on one's view of the book of Hebrews and its human authorship. 13 that were Pauline, and if Hebrews was written by Paul, then 14 books, and then 7 general epistles. And then the 1 book of prophecy. Now then, we've looked at the way in which we classify them. There are 15 periods of time in the Bible. You should memorize these 15 periods. It will be on the test, as Brother Gallagher would put it. If you did not or do not have one of these sheets that nobody can read, but in order to get them on one sheet of paper, it had to be really small print. It's not my work. It was the work of someone else. I don't know who to give credit to because I got it when we lived in Lubbock and we moved from there in 1968. I had one of these folded up and put in my Bible until I quit using the physical Bible and went to iPads. That's how long that I kept that in my Bible. So if you didn't get one, would you take this back to Jenny? Anyone else?
I would not have one. Thank you very much. Yeah, I got it.
Where was everyone when I handed these out before?
I just gave mine to her. Lost my answer. Thank you. One more. Well, I'm not getting in an argument. But I grabbed two.
What?
Has it always been this small?
I'm not getting
It was actually smaller than the one that I had. And to keep it all on one sheet of paper, there's no other way to do it other than through that. This gives just the periods of the Old Testament. And we're going to look at that this evening. And these are listed in the book as well, but this sheet gives more information. Now, John thought this was too big of print and everything, so I had to make him his own special one that was a lot smaller. The one that I made for John, I think, was about 25% the size of this one that y'all have. So, the first period, though, is the antediluvian period. What does the word diluvian mean? Flood. What does the word anti mean? Before. So what does antediluvian mean? Boy, that was difficult, wasn't it? That's going to be on the test. The period before the flood. It began at creation, and if you look on this sheet, and you can actually read it, it has from 4004 to 2348 BC, which would be 1,656 years. It is usually, let's see. That actually is the same date as what's in the book as well, or time period. Starts at creation and goes to, guess what? The flood. The major people of that time would be Adam and Eve. Their two sons in particular, but then Seth as well. So Cain, Abel, and Seth. And then, of course, Enoch, what sets him apart?
He was taken up in heaven.
Okay, he walked with God, and thus God took him, and he did not die in that sense. So that's the antediluvian. Then you have the post-diluvian. What does post mean? That's one of those post hole diggers, right? Huh? It means after. And then a diluvian again, flood. It's that period that is after the flood. It lasts from 2348 to 1921 BC. And covered, our book has 472 years. I think it's on here, 427. It covers from the flood to basically Abraham. During that time, of course, you would have Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, so that how many souls were saved by water? 8 souls were saved by water, and it becomes a type of baptism that saves us, 1 Peter 3:20 and 21. Then you have the patriarchal period. That's what's in our book, patriarchs. It's difficult if you use patriarchal to distinguish between the patriarchal period and the patriarchal dispensation, isn't it? Same word. So the patriarchs.
Why does they have Rachel down there twice? That remind you of something later?
You mean
After Bilhah, and then before Zilpah, and Rachel was listed again. I guess you can do that time.
because that divides up the different children, starting with Leah and her 6 sons, then Rachel and her 2 sons, Bilhah, 2 sons, and Zilpah, 2 sons. So it just divides them up so that it lets you know who had whom. The patriarchs basically starts with Abraham, and you'd have Isaac. Are you raising your hand or? Oh, okay.
I was curious why they cut the post-diluvian era off. We're still on the post-diluvian right now. Why did they only, why was the tendency for it to stop at 427 years?
Because of Abraham, and you really start another period of time then, and really there's nothing else distinguishing other than the Tower of Babel in that period. You have the flood and its end, the Tower of Babel, and then going to Abraham. So there's no real good alternative to calling it anything. But at the call of Abraham, or at Abraham, you have to start having another period of time. The patriarchs, or the patriarchal period, is what's in the book. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph really deal with, or what's dealt with in this period of the patriarchs.
So they don't usually consider Joseph as one of the patriarchs, though, do they? Or do they?
Generally, it's just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Joseph was also in that period, even though he was not considered in the normal way that we would think a patriarch, but only because, and I'm dealing with, when I say the patriarchs, the most prominent people during that time. I'm not saying that he was a patriarch, because from the classification of patriarchs, he would not be considered one. Not like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those were the patriarchs. But when you're dealing with the patriarchs as far as a period, he was in that period, and so would have been considered a prominent figure in that period. He was a very prominent figure during that period, in fact.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we would call it a promise going.
Yes. And he did not particularly figure into that promise, but Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. So that's why they are considered patriarchs and he's not. But of course, everyone remembers, I'm sure, what happened to him, being sold into slavery down into Egypt, and the dreams that he interpreted. Finally, Pharaoh's dream, where he is elevated to second in command under Pharaoh and only under Pharaoh. And as a result of the famine that comes, he moves his family to Egypt. And so finally there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and he put them into slavery. So you have that period of slavery during this period of, that gets us right to the period of bondage, where they are in bondage. During that time, I guess the most prominent would be, you could add Joseph to, not really to this period, but he's the one who took them or brought them to Egypt, where the bondage began. And then our book has it the Egyptian period, and as I put it, the period of bondage. That is going from that time they go down to Egypt to the crossing of the Red Sea, about 215 years. Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh would certainly be the prominent figures during that time. Of course, Moses kind of rebelling against going and doing what God wanted him to do, tried to offer excuses, and God took away all of his excuses. And finally he goes, tells Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. And Pharaoh's response was, who's Yahweh that I should hear him? And then he said, y'all have too much time on your hands. We're going to make it harder on you. So, thus the conflict between God and Pharaoh, and we know who won that one, don't we? Paul, you were going to add something?
I was going to say about Pharaoh would be a good study in his dynasty. That's what took over whenever Joseph came in, and that's why he could do that, because of their philosophy. They were shepherds.
I don't know how many dynasties there's been. They were all referred to as Pharaoh, even though it would have been a totally different dynasty or family. And so that's one of those things I never did study that much. Tim probably knows every detail about it.
Well, the Hebrew presented him a lot about the different and how they fit into the providence.
The providence of God in that.
Called the shepherd king.
Right. Mm.
And the regular Egyptian hated shepherds.
Right. Well,
Paul wrote, even for the same purpose of I raised you up, I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared to all the earth.
Okay.
Romans 9, somewhere about halfway through the chapter.
That, let me add on that, that God's name would have been shown to be glorious if at the very beginning Moses, when he went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, if Pharaoh had said, yes, you can go. That would have shown God's power, and he would have been glorified by that. Of course, he didn't, and so God showed his power in a different way by bringing the 10 plagues. So that's all that happened on the sheet that I gave you there. The 10 plagues are listed. But that would be the, as the book says, Egyptian period. I call it the period of bondage. And by the way, I should have said this at the very beginning. These are very natural divisions. This just presents an overview of the Old Testament. That's why you need to memorize it, these 15 periods. If you use the terminology that's in the book, that's fine. If you use terminology that's on this sheet, that's fine. But it allows you, anytime something's mentioned, to give a certain time frame as to when it took place. That's why I say it's just the time periods themselves give you a good overview of the Old Testament. With the 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally lets the children of Israel go, and they go to where?
Sinai.
Mount Sinai. And they receive the law at that point in time. They were supposed to go into the land of Palestine, the promised land. They sent 12 spies in. 10 of them come back with a report, we can't take them. Their cities are walled, and they are strong, and they're powerful. Some of them are giants. We can't take them.
Well, how fast did they forget the 10 plagues and what happened there? Wow. And then how many times they threw it out the window?
Okay, Dale. It doesn't matter right now. It's a very short period of time, yes. Just a matter of months. 2 of them came back with a positive report. Let us go up and take the land. Who were those 2? Joshua and Caleb. And because of the bad report and the people believing the bad report, God said you're going to wander in the wilderness, and thus 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And during that period of time, of course, you have Moses, who is the leader. You have the beginning of the Aaronic priesthood. So you have Aaron. There's other individuals that are listed in our book, but or on that paper. But those really are your prominent people during that time. There's others certainly that we would know of, but that's during the period of wilderness wanderings in which they wandered for 40 years. After those 40 years, they come to, and that generation passes away. I had this, sometime just sit down and do a little bit of math. I know that's not some people's forte, but consider 40 years, and then consider how many people came up out of Egypt, of the Israelites. The estimates are anywhere from 2 million to 7 million, probably somewhere closer to the 5 million mark. And then consider how many people died every day. Figure it up. You want to talk about a death march? This was a death march, with the number of deaths that people are dying every single day. Why? Because they rejected God.
One thing I thought was interesting was that article we had in the bulletin, how wide that people had to be to move, how wide you think the Red Sea just a narrow place.
Yeah, probably 3 or 4 people. Yeah,
Miles wide.
it would have had to have been miles wide for them to make it through in one night. And then, if I remember right, it talked about also all of the huge amounts of food and water and everything else that would be necessary in moving. Well, you just think, if we just took Pensacola, that not even, or Pensacola and the entire Escambia County, not even close to 1 million people, is it? Think about having to move everyone and feed everyone in Pensacola or Escambia County for years. And moving them on foot. You can see the monumental task that God had given Moses to lead these people. And you might understand, some of the people starting to complain at times as well. But that then, they come to the Red Sea finally, to where God is going to allow them to cross over into the land of Canaan. And so we have a period when they're going into the land of Canaan of conquest. They have to take the land. That started lasted about 51 years. Joshua was their leader at that time, because Moses, because of his sin in striking the rock when God said to speak to the rock, he was not allowed to take the children of Israel into the land of Canaan. He was able to see it, but he did not get to go in. But the sheet there also lists Caleb, the other spy who turned in a good report. Rahab, of course, becomes a prominent individual in the taking of what city? Jericho. And then Achan becomes a prominent figure in the next city, Ai, in which, because he took some of the accursed things in Jericho, they lost at Ai. But finally, they take the land in that period of conquest, but just like they had been the entire time during the wilderness wanderings, they didn't stay faithful very long. And so God would have to send an oppressing nation over them. And they, because of that oppression, would repent and call upon God to deliver them, and so God would send a judge. A judge was someone to deliver them. He was a leader to deliver them from the oppression that they were under at that time. There are 15 judges. Probably the best known would be Samson. And there was actually a preacher who preached an entire sermon saying Tarzan instead of Samson. And everyone continued to laugh the entire sermon until he got home and his wife told him, "You were saying Tarzan, not Samson." But he was probably one of the best known judge because of the great strength that he had. And the other probably best known judge would have been Samuel. He was the last of those judges. And who's Samson? I almost started to say Tarzan. Just you're right. He had great strength physically, but he didn't have much brain. He didn't show any wisdom at all. But then Samuel, he was the last of the judges, and his sons were evil. So the people asked for a king to rule over them, and because they wanted to be like the nations round about them. Boy, couldn't we preach a sermon about that in the church today? How the church so many times wants to be like the denominations around us. So, as a result of that, we leave the period of the judges and we enter the period of the United Kingdom. During that period of the United Kingdom, and that from the last judge to the period of the division of the kingdom, there were 120 years. How many kings?
19?
Nope.
All three.
There were 3 kings during the United Kingdom. Who were they? It's going to be on the test. Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon. How long did each one of them reign? Each one reigned for 40 years. So it's really simple to remember those. Because of sin again, God divides the kingdom. You have, at this point in time, the period of the divided kingdom, you have the northern kingdom that's called Israel. It's also referred to as Ephraim at times. You have the northern kingdom, Ephraim, or Israel. And you had 19 kings, I believe, there. The most prominent figure there would have been Jeroboam, because he changed the worship. He brought in the idol worship at Dan and Bethel, in particular, Jeroboam. Because he was afraid that the people would go back to Jerusalem to worship and their hearts would be turned toward Jerusalem instead of him. And so he would tell them, it's too far, it's too difficult to go there. We'll build these tabernacles here, or temples here, and they introduced idol worship. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, and his stupidity caused or brought about the division when the people said, ease the tax burden. I'm not going to say anything about nowadays. And Rehoboam says, come back in 3 days and I'll give you an answer. Goes to the older people and they said, if you'll ease their tax burden on them, they'll follow you from now on. He didn't like that advice, so he goes to younger people and they say, tell them you're going to make it far worse. And they're going to be punished more severely. So that's what he tells them, and that's what brought about the division. Now, that division was, of course, as a direct result of what God intervening in the affairs. Most, or all of the kings of the northern kingdom were evil. Most of the ones of the northern king, or the southern kingdom of Judah, it's also called Judah or southern kingdom, most of those were evil. but there were a few good ones. And if you look on this sheet of paper I gave you, you'll see several names that are listed that were good ones. And that's the Bible stating that they are good. Some of them were not good the entire time. Some of them were good part of the time. But Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Uzzah, Jotham, Hezekiah, those that are mentioned as being good kings. You have several of the prophets that are listed on that sheet. But that period of the divided kingdom lasted from that division till the time in which the northern kingdom of Israel was carried into captivity. Who carried them into captivity?
Is that true? Or some of the points tonight without yet?
It was the Assyrians.
Shia? No, one.
The Assyrians.
Yeah, but who was the king?
I believe it was Sennacherib.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
The Assyrians carried them into captivity. That would have been at 722 BC. So that leaves a period of where you have Judah, the southern kingdom, by itself. So, Kingdom of Judah period, as the book has it, or Judah alone as I had it. 136 years about. The book has 150 years. From the division till the Babylonian armies under Nebuchadnezzar come and take take Jerusalem. There were 3 carrying aways into captivity starting at 606 BC with the final destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Daniel, Nadab, Abihu, and my mind just went.
I forget it too.
What's the other one?
Of all time.
Abednego.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Those 3. How can you forget to bed we go? Those would have been carried away at 606. The captivity was prophesied it was going to be 70 years long. So going from 606, 70 years, at 536, well, you have then that period of exile, or the period of captivity in the book. That would is generally considered 586 because that's the final destruction of Jerusalem. The 70 years being from 606 to the time in which Cyrus the Great allows them to return to Jerusalem. So 70 years. You'll see on this sheet 50 years because it's taking 586. The destruction of Jerusalem doesn't consider those other 20 years there.
Jeremiah 25-29 gives 2 parallel predictions with different words about 70 years prophecy.
That's what I've been saying. It was 70 years. So, but that would have been the period of exile in which then Cyrus the Great says, you can go home to Jerusalem. Many, if not most, of the people remained where they were. After that period of exile, then you have the post-exilic period, or the period of restoration. That is that from that decree of Cyrus to the end of the Old Testament record, which would have been around 400 BC. And at 400 BC, you have then the ending of the Old Testament as far as a written record that we have. The sheet also mentions the intertestamental period, that is, that period between testaments. So the period between the testaments from 400 BC to, and the sheet has 4 BC, which would be the time of John the Baptist and Jesus. Our book has about 440 years, depending on the dates, again, of the books. The Roman Catholic apocryphal books, many of them deal with that period of time. Excellent historical material, not inspired of God. So understand the difference. It has a lot of good history, but that's what it is, history. It's not something that was inspired by God. But then you have John the Baptist and Jesus coming on the scene, and so you have that period of the life of Christ, about 33 and a half, 34 years, as the book says, to Acts, the 2nd chapter, and Pentecost. And then from Pentecost of Acts, the 2nd chapter, to the end of Revelation, you have the period of the New Testament church. I would rather say, instead of the end of Revelation until Christ comes again, is the period of the church, or that New Testament church period. Because the church did not end, in Revelation. It might have been the last book written. There's some debate about that even. But the book is taking it from the standpoint of a written record of the New Testament church. The New Testament church will continue till Christ comes the second time. And the end of time will then be taking place, and we will have a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous at the same time. And judgment takes place. There will be that separation, those going to heaven and those going into hell, going into their eternal abode. And that would end that period of the New Testament church. So, I was able to complete it. Didn't think I would. Next week, we're going to get into Lesson 2, except we really won't cover Lesson 2. Since Lesson 2 is dealing with the study of the Bible, I'm going to deal more with some other materials as to how to interpret, how to study the Bible. And so we'll be looking at that. And then after I present my material, then we'll kind of go through what the book says. So